Jorge Clavellina is a person known to some supporters of Most Holy Family Monastery, or MHFM, who himself was an MHFM supporter for many years, but recently began an aggressive campaign against MHFM. Jorge claims that MHFM has committed the mortal sin of detraction because they contacted Catholics familiar with Jorge and revealed things concerning his moral depravity, which he had admitted to them via emails in 2014. For this situation to make sense, it's important to understand what Jorge did/founded, what detraction is, what MHFM released, why MHFM was justified in taking the course of action they did, and the accusations of occultism and Jorge's 90-page rebuttal. Jorge is not acting as a private individual because he operates a quote apostolate, which he started in 2012, which he later called rexisrael.com. Although he took down the site amidst tensions with MHFM, fragments of data still show up in Google searches. By undertaking the responsibility of running a quote apostolate, Jorge raised his culpability and positioned himself as a public figure. These points must be emphasized because he doesn't want people to realize these central facts. He's playing the role of a poor victim, but he doesn't mention that before MHFM revealed facts about his sins, Jorge had publicly denounced MHFM as, quote, reprehensible, had attacked MHFM's work in various ways to various MHFM supporters, had falsely stated that MHFM gives a pass to certain people for inappropriate behavior, and had indicated that he wanted to start a public outreach against MHFM. Before Jorge did those things, MHFM planned to ignore him, but after he did those things, MHFM felt it was necessary and just to reveal facts about Jorge to certain people who may have been influenced by him. Since Jorge was presenting himself as a spiritual guide to Catholics, while aggressively condemning other Catholics in unjust ways, his past sins became relevant. Jorge's smear campaign is relying on the premise that he, Jorge, is a private individual and is a good Catholic who's amended his life. He merely disagrees with MHFM on a secular issue. Therefore, MHFM had no right to, quote, bully him by revealing those details about him. The truth of the matter is that Jorge is a blind guide and evil deceiver who at this point needs to be exposed as a spiritual fraud. He needs to stop pretending to be a spiritual director and focus on amending his life. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that to reveal a hidden sin can be justified. Quote, therefore it should be said that to reveal the hidden sin of someone by denunciation so that he might amend, or by accusation for the good of public justice, is not detraction. There St. Thomas Aquinas points out that in certain cases it's justified to reveal hidden sins. It should be said that sins revealed in the sacrament of confession can never be revealed by the priest, but emails to MHFM do not rise to that level, so they do not bear the seal of confession. This is the most important excerpt from the email MHFM sent out. Quote, Jorge Clavellina revealed to us in 2014 that he consistently fell into mortal sin. Basically, he was a porn addict who could not refrain from impurity. He was consistently falling into mortal sins of impurity after his conversion, while he was a married man, while he purported to be a traditional Catholic, and while he was strongly preaching to others and strongly condemning others. Jorge is claiming that this email MHFM sent to certain people constitutes detraction, since according to him, he's amended his life. The reality is that Jorge has not amended his life, and what MHFM did was not detraction, since Jorge needs to be exposed for the good of the public justice. In fact, Jorge has basically said he will devote the rest of his life to attacking MHFM. Quote, if I have to upload videos against that wicked organization for the next 40 years, I will gladly do so. So at this point, he must be exposed to an even greater degree. But first, a little bit on his quote apostolate. Jorge started his quote apostolate only a month after his conversion to the true positions. Quote, this Catholic apostolate is not affiliated with Most Holy Family Monastery. This ministry began about a month after my conversion. People should not start an apostolate a month after their conversion. That's too soon. This shows Jorge's pride and desire to be regarded. Instead of fixing his own life, he wants to jump right into instructing others. Also, in 2012, when he started his quote apostolate, he had a major problem with impurity and even pornography. This is a quote from a 2014 email that Jorge has made completely public on his YouTube channel. Quote, "Unfortunately, yeah, I had a real problem with impure images and pornography. I'm being a slave of that sin my whole life." It takes a lot of pride to think you should be running an apostolate while being a slave to impurity. Jesus says take the plank out of your own eye before trying to take the speck out of your brother's eye. God pulled grace from Jorge over the years, and he fell deeper and deeper into a delusional pit. Jorge is married, and his state of life requires him to provide for his family first and foremost, but he's lazy, shirking his duty to adequately provide for his family. MHFM mentioned this by saying Jorge is a freeloader. Quote, "Jorge is also basically a freeloader. He was getting donations from some of our supporters sometime in the past. Maybe not anymore. And he might not even have a job. He is a disgraceful individual. We also noticed that he would seemingly strategically place comments on some of our most popular videos, perhaps in significant part to get his own channel out there." Jorge countered this point in one of his videos by claiming he runs a quote company. The company Jorge runs only proves his sloth and incompetence. He's talking about his barely known website called vivacristoRey.org, where he sells a number of books under the pseudonym Pablo Claret. Most of these books are just reprints written by various Catholic authors, but there's one book in particular Jorge wrote. This is his book, Rosary for Beginners. It illustrates Jorge's lack of judgment and personal spiritual problems. The book is basically a 15-decade rosary spelled out in unnecessary and tediously repetitive detail. He literally copied and pasted the Hail Mary 10 times for each decade. He also has graphics saying, "You are here, so you don't get lost." He also reveals in this book that learning the rosary was very difficult for him. Quote, "That is, if you're a complete beginner in this subject and you have no one to help you, learning to pray this important devotion can be an extremely difficult job, from my own experience of having trouble praying the rosary. This challenge isn't surprising given Jorge's pride. God pulled so much grace from him that he struggled to even say the rosary. He then projected his problem onto others by thinking it would be a great idea to write this book. Then, if that weren't bad enough, he uses this quote company as an excuse to not sufficiently work to provide for his family. This is an excerpt from an email Jorge sent to a Catholic. Quote, "It is indeed true that I don't have a job at the time, and am planning on maybe get a job sometime in the future." This is from that same email. Quote, "These past days I have been able to stay at home, because we have some money, and thus we were able to create the ebook in less than a week. Yesterday we started selling, and today I sell one ebook." Anyone who views Jorge's catalog will immediately realize sales from this quote company won't create enough income to provide for his family. He needs to accept that he has to get back into the workforce, but he desperately wants to be an important figure, like an entrepreneur, an author, or a spiritual guide. In fact, he wants to be all three at once. He pursues selfish goals at the expense of his family's welfare. This excerpt is from the same email where Jorge said he doesn't have a job and that he, quote, maybe will get a job sometime in the future. Quote, "But in the case of my wife, could be fatal for our child. Since she is underweight, since the time I meet her, it is a trend that we could not overcome just yet. And the primary reason is that I didn't earn enough money to feed her, as it should to gain weight fast. I believe this is one of the reasons that we have some miscarriages in the past." He needs to show basic charity to his wife and his unborn children, and stop pursuing his selfish goals to their detriment. The reality is that Jorge cares more about his quote apostolate than he does his family's needs. This question actually came up in the 90-page document Jorge released regarding an accusation of him doing occult activities. MHFM asked Jorge a number of questions, and this was one of them. Quote, "When you were told that you should fulfill your state of life, you said that your apostolate was more important than your family. Do you still hold this idea? Because such a mentality is totally in error. Your family is your primary obligation. Jorge's answer to this question was unnecessarily tedious, but his words are less revealing than the actions he took. He worked for 2 months for 8 hours a day to produce a 90-page document, both in English and Spanish, in a response to several questions posed by MHFM. In a telling comment on one of his YouTube videos, Jorge declared the following, quote, "The most shocking part is that after spending so much time to defend myself, barely able to pay rent, suffering hunger some days, I just say this to add necessary context as far as how much this letter cost me." And the video itself said the following in text on screen, quote, "I work 8 hours straight for the span of 2 months to write that document. Even though, at the time, I needed to work for my family and barely paid rent those months, and I was in a dire economic situation overall." People cannot resign from their state of life to write incredibly long documents attempting to defend their image. In fact, it's so unreasonable that it's a mortal sin. In his blindness and in an attempt to elicit pity, he unwittingly gave out details which prove his state of mortal sin. The mortal sin involved in creating this document shows his deep-seated selfishness and disregard for his family. He doesn't want to work, so he doesn't. Rather, he wants to be regarded and seen as important, so that's what he goes after. He saw the accusations addressed in the document as threatening his selfish goals, so he completely abandoned his state of life in a feeble attempt to defend himself. Furthermore, it's noteworthy that Jorge wrongly accused MHFM of mortal sin numerous times, but amidst his feud with MHFM, he also gave out incriminating details about himself which prove his own darkened state of mortal sin. Now let's look at Jorge's 90-page document, which I have carefully read, and examine some of the accusations and some of Jorge's responses. After examining this document, it will become clear what's really going on. Note that the English versions of these questions are translations made by Jorge and his wife of questions that were sent to him in Spanish. Thus, they are not how MHFM would have worded them in English. In this document, Jorge answers MHFM's various questions in an unbelievably long-winded way. He's attempting to hide the truth under piles and piles of unnecessary information. But when Jorge was asked a question which was not going to elicit any incriminating details, notice how short and concise his answer is. MHFM asked, quote, "Is it true that you paid to have a Prime Seller account to sell your book?" Answer, "No, this is not true. The only accounts I have to sell our book, Rosary for Beginners, are 1. A Kindle Direct Publishing account, which is free. 2. An Audible account, which is free. 3. A Google Publisher account, which is free." However, when a specific question is asked that might elicit admissions of wrongdoing, he writes exasperatingly long explanations. He will even quote irrelevant material at length. One accusation that showed Jorge was being deceived by evil spirits was Jorge and his wife developing a new way of speaking, which they referred to as, quote, pure talk. MHFM asked him about this. This was the question MHFM asked, quote, "Or also the case of having a supposed perfect speech, where according to you it would be almost impossible to fall into the sins of the language. I suppose it is the pure talk of which has been mentioned before, and that you supposedly learned from this after a spiritual earthquake, so to speak. Maybe all this is connected to what you supposedly spoke of, messages of a spiritual awakening where secret knowledge is received. Do you still hold these things? This is serious." Jorge's answer was long and evasive. His response to this particular accusation is actually about 22 pages long. It starts on page 20 and ends on page 42. In his response, he quotes a dream of St. John Bosco that takes up about 8 pages. This is the activity of someone engaging in deception. But, despite his efforts at concealment, he admits to some wrongdoing. Jorge wanted to give the impression that, quote, pure talk was trying to talk about spiritual things, avoid gossip and unnecessary chat. But he let it slip that it was actually more than that. There was some kind of novel formulaic structure that governed, quote, pure talk. When implemented, Jorge and his wife sounded robotic and strange. Here's what Jorge had to say on the matter. Quote, "It happens that the beginning of their thinking has to do with God, and the end of the thought also ends in God, and that we should try to imitate this in a conscious and specific way. Honestly, I got overexcited. I felt a lot of fervor for that idea." Jorge's weighty admission is corroborated by an email I got from a Catholic who actually heard Jorge's wife use, quote, pure talk. This is how they described it. Quote, "If I remember correctly, when one begins to converse in pure talk, which was their attempt to imitate in some way how the angels speak in heaven, it involved some sort of statement of self-abasement and an attempt to praise God before discussing a subject." Quote, "Pure talk was a demonic deception that Jorge and his wife fell under. Jorge desperately didn't want to admit the full truth because he didn't want MHFM giving him a clear rebuke that he should cease his, quote, apostolate. Having reviewed all the evidence, I believe Jorge is deceived and is a false mystic. He will deny any mysticism, but it's clear that's what's going on. He even emphasized in the document that, quote, this is purely human knowledge that I have derived by purely human and Catholic sources. He is trying to say that all his thoughts are just him reasoning things out, but this isn't true. Around the time when Jorge was under his, quote, pure talk delusion, he experienced what he called a, quote, spiritual earthquake. He said the following in context of answering the, quote, pure talk question on page 37. Quote, "I thought it was remarkable that the physical earthquake had happened in the midst of these events, and mentioned that I believed this was a spiritual earthquake. If one says that a, quote, spiritual earthquake happened in the midst of inventing a new form of speech, that's a claim to a mystical experience. But, quote, pure talk wasn't the only false spiritual message Jorge was receiving. In an email he gave to a Catholic, Jorge started to drift into heresy. He claimed to have received a, quote, extremely powerful light, and was, quote, beside himself in amazement at this new, quote, spiritual information. He said something that is not in line with Catholic teaching and is, in fact, very close to the heresy of faith alone. Jorge said, quote, it is impossible for that soul, as long as he sees the whole truth and accepts it, to become a reprobate. In the same email, he also said, quote, the only way to be damned is to believe lies, to believe that something that is against reality is true, to believe that something that is unreal is true. This grave error of Jorge's is important to remember because it gives context to the most serious accusation leveled against Jorge. An MHFM supporter heard Jorge describe strange things, and he eventually related the conversation to MHFM. This is a quote from Jorge's 90-page document that describes the allegations. MHFM asks, quote, Jorge, we were informed that you were doing the things described below. We must say that we were greatly dismayed to read this allegation. If you are actually doing what is described below, you are involved with evil. The claim is as follows. Jorge is doing this exercise over and over, and is getting responses from his, quote, soul. His wife is doing it also. His wife also received her secret purpose. At one point, Jorge was using this meditation to try to discover other people's secret purposes. He was doing the exercise to try to discover his mother's secret purpose. Jorge said that if you ask your soul what it wants and it answers something good, then it means you did a good job. You nailed it, and the good response is your secret purpose. Jorge would not reveal his spiritual secret. He said that it is far too personal. But Jorge only talked about the good response from your soul briefly. He then talked at length about what happens when you get an evil response from your soul. He said to be careful because the meditation can be very scary, and you will be shocked at the evil things your soul asks for. He then said if your soul asks for something evil and you accept, you are damned. End of quote. If you are doing this, you need to stop doing it immediately. You are basically trying to contact demonic entities. Jorge wants to make it seem like this allegation is ridiculous and comes out of the clear blue sky, but his own words tell a different story. In Jorge's response to this allegation, which is very long, He sometimes acts like he simply never said anything like what was described, and other times he somewhat admits to it. For example, listen to the vigor with which Jorge denies the allegation from this excerpt. Quote, I will reiterate the truth one last time. Asking questions to, or having conversations with, your soul, that is also a third-party entity, was never communicated to the MHFM supporter. He is an astounding liar. Now listen to this excerpt, in which he somewhat admits to it. Quote, I've never said that I'm getting responses from my quote soul, as if that soul is a third-party entity. That would obviously be occultist. I thought I was explaining things in a manner that was understandable, although maybe I should have been even more precise and careful when talking with the MHFM supporter. And for that possible error, I already made a confession. He then went on to make another admission, where he said, quote, Lastly, I did use the phrase, you are damned. It was incorrect and at best weak for communicating my point, which also was included in my last confession. Jorge is sometimes arguing that the MHFM supporter was making completely baseless charges against him, and other times he's chalking aspects of the allegations up to miscommunications. Those, quote, miscommunications were significant enough for Jorge to confess them. Jorge's story, that there was a series of, quote, miscommunications, isn't that believable. Also, one of Jorge's defenses against the accusations of him practicing occult activities was his ardent support and promotion of MHFM. Remember, he released his 90-page document during his fight with MHFM as proof to the general public that he's not involved with occult activities. Here's a very interesting excerpt from where he's arguing for his innocence. Quote, Usually when a person is becoming a heretic or dabbling in evil doctrines, he or she will first and foremost cease to preach at their usual pace. For instance, if before they were sharing 100 Saints quotes on Twitter with MHFM's link every week, they now only share 10 in the same amount of time. But in our case, we were the same. Even though we have been through some economic issues that have delayed us, we are still with the same determination than before. And if anything, that determination has just grown stronger. According to Jorge's personal belief, which I'm not endorsing, declining promotion of MHFM's material, also known as Vatican Catholic, is a sign of becoming a heretic or dabbling in evil doctrines. The example he used was 100 tweets with MHFM's link being reduced to 10 in the same space of time. This example is quite telling, considering that right now, he actually has a video titled, quote, Vatican Catholic deserves zero promotion. Update. The blindness is stunning. He's condemned out of his own mouth. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit what he really did, so he deceived himself with a very long explanation. He even said, in his document, that if he hadn't converted, perhaps he would have become the creator of a false religion. Take that telling statement and combine it with the quote peer talk and the quote spiritual earthquake, and then his drifting into airs that are close to faith alone. Taken as a whole, Jorge engaging in occult activity isn't unbelievable. It's actually quite believable. Also, if Jorge thinks that one cannot be damned if they accept the quote whole truth, it does follow that he would likely attempt to find hidden knowledge about himself. Jorge has been deceived by the devil and is now under his influence. Jorge wants MHFM to be destroyed so that he can be the new go-to for spiritual guidance. It should also be noted that Jorge now rejects the idea that we're at the end of the world. He's particularly attacking MHFM's end times interpretations. For example, he's explicitly rejected MHFM's argument that John Paul II is the Antichrist. Interestingly, Jorge's quote apostolate actually started on October 22, 2012, which just so happens to be the same day that 2 years later became the quote feast day of John Paul II in 2014. It looks like Providence foresaw Jorge's Judas-like attacks on the church in the end times, and for that reason gave his quote apostolate a mark of darkness. The spirit that's guiding Jorge's attacks on MHFM is the spirit of the Antichrist. Jorge Clavellina is a blind guide and an arrogant deceiver. People should unsubscribe from his channels and block him. He should not be supported or followed, because when the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the pit.